All right, I think we're going. Welcome back to another one of these things where we're just kind of talking about whatever comes to mind. Hope you're having a wonderful Tuesday. Getting to that halfway point through the week. Woohoo! And as usual, the main reason I'm aware that it's Tuesday is because I had to write a haiku. So, interesting thing about that is this one's like today's haiku was really more I just pretty arbitrarily go through like trying to find like an image that I feel like writing a poem about for that day or like days in advance. Like lately I've just been looking up a photo like that day and then spending like half an hour to an hour just looking at it and like seeing what do I observe most about this thing, about this moment in time that was captured a while ago. In a lot of cases, these are just from like past vacations lately. I need to get back out there and start taking more photos, but haven't really been getting out too much. Need to go change that. But this whole month, and it might even be further back, like if I go back and like look at what I'm usually writing about or what I'm usually capturing about a photo for any one of these posts. But like over the course of this month, I've been noticing that a lot of them, maybe all of them, have been loosely around the concept of perspective. Like, it's kind of a weird thing to describe because I'm pretty sure it's just core to like just the human experience, which is something I kind of want to talk a little bit about. I think it was 2 weeks ago that I had posted the haiku that I wrote was about clouds that looked like they were coming over a plateau in Africa, and it looked like the plateau was like spewing out the clouds, but that wouldn't look that way depending on if I were looking at it from any other real angle. I just happened to be in a position where taking a picture at that moment made it look like the clouds were emerging out of the top of the plateau. Then last week's was another thing with clouds and structures coming out of the ground, mountains, and how the clouds going over them made it look like the mountains were kind of closer, because I don't know why, but it felt like when I was looking at the picture, the clouds seemed closer than the mountains. Which is, I guess, true, because the clouds are in front of the mountains. They're blocking the mountains' view from my perspective. But the mountains also feel like, I guess, equal parts large and small just from where I was standing. Like, I can see them, like 3 mountains. Just I can see them from where I was standing. But in my head, I realized that mountains are huge, and getting to the top of that thing would be no easy feat. That I was kind of using my perspective to be aware of where I was compared to this thing, and where I'm seeing it from, it's like fully encapsulated in my field of view, but understanding that if I continued walking in that direction, I probably wouldn't reach that place for days. It was kind of a weird thing that it's like that feeling of depth, that seeing the clouds feeling so close because they were kind of low, and I'm used to being near clouds in foggy weather. There's something that I'm familiar with being close to. I'm not super familiar with being close to mountains, but because there was that bridge between me and the mountain, that cloud interface, I'm used to dealing with that. I can understand generally how close those are and help bridge that gap between me and this thing I'm not used to interfacing with. And it gave me more information to build my perspective from that moment. Granted, I wasn't really thinking about it much when I was taking the picture, but when I'm thinking about it after taking it, that's kind of interesting. It was like where the first one was just the angle from which I was viewing something made something look a particular way. In the case of last week's photo, the perspective was really more from like a depth perspective. It really wasn't an angle. I could have looked at that from any number of positions, and that would have still looked like the clouds were in front of the mountains, and the mountains were still equal parts small and large. Today's was more another positional kind of thing, but also kind of how humans like to attribute meaning to certain things that we see. So today's was, it was a path that we were walking. I think it was in the same location or same general area as the mountain picture. This was in, I think, Grand Teton National Park, but in a forested area, not one that was like by a pond overlooking mountains. It was all still a forested area. We were just outside of the woodland at the time. But this one was a path going through the trees, and the trees at one point, they were really, really tall. They're really, really tall trees. And toward the top of them, they would form, like their leaves, their branches would come close to each other to a point where it looked like a really large arch, just a big gateway. And probably why I wanted to take a picture at that time is because it seemed like a gateway. It seemed like just this grand arch that was going somewhere else. But that's really just people applying some meaning that doesn't really exist to something in the real world. Even if I did consider that some kind of gateway, today I was thinking, well, where does that gateway lead? It leads to the same world. It's just on the other side of that gateway. And I can even see parts of what are over there from where I'm standing when I'm taking the picture, but there's still this much grander meaning, or this grander meaning can be applied to it just because people like perceiving gateways as doors to other opportunities, doors to new worlds, essentially. And it's just kind of funny when I take a step back and be like, why am I applying this like gateway metaphor to this, I don't know, phenomenon? It's just a happenstance within time that I'm able to see because of my perspective. And I can see it, but I'm not really attributing like the arch. I'm not like exploring why the arch looks like an arch from where I'm at. I'm exploring why I'm considering it a gateway and why the other side of that gateway holds a lot of meaning for no reason. Because on the other side, it's still the earth. It's just you're looking at it from the other side of that gateway now. The only new thing over there is a new perspective. It's a new way of looking at something that you already had access to. It's just the view is currently being obstructed by something. By the very gateway that we were talking about being a way into another world, when in reality the gateway was just blocking our view of the same world. But it was just another one of those explorations of perspective. And I couldn't help but start thinking about how much that just sort of bleeds into everything. Just everything. Like, I feel like I'm more rambly than I normally am here, because I feel like there's a lot to talk about with this particular topic, but it's just so broad that it's hard to, without having thought of what I was going to say ahead of time, like stick to one thing. So like another example of like that perspective being a fairly integral part in understanding something or feeling something or being a part of how we perceive or how we experience this world. Alongside the project that I'm working on, I need to collect a lot of data to basically just get a bunch of plant data. And when people do scan for certain plants in arboretums and botanical gardens, they're shown information about what this plant is, its name, kind of how to identify it, and things like that. Just really basic stuff. But despite that being fairly basic information, the data that I have access to, or at least that's publicly accessible right now, is basically just notes from other people. And while I was working on finding this information to present in a cleaner structural way, like I want to know a leaf structure is opposite, alternate, or world. But that was not usually said like just as a property on something very clearly. It was in a sentence, a longer sentence, going over what somebody observed about this thing in greater detail. And depending on what you want, either one of those could arguably be better or worse. So because I want to build something that has to find data quickly, having a very succinct way of saying that these leaves are this certain way, they're organized in this certain pattern, then having it as something that I can get at very predictably would be helpful. But that's not really what people were looking to do when they're discovering plants, or when they're documenting them or organizing their thoughts. They're going to take nuanced notes about what they see, because at the time of identifying something, they don't know like what the important aspects about this thing are going to be. That's the same way with identifying anything. People don't know what the system is, what the structure is going to be when something is initially documented. You just write as many notes about it as you can. That way people who do organize these thoughts later have a lot of things that they could organize by or categorize by. But that perspective is pretty important. So, and perspective in like two ways. So from the people who are documenting something versus the people like me who are trying to make data more accessible in clean ways, depending on that perspective, how that data is structured, like there's what's the word I'm looking for? There's more optimal ways to structure that data, whether it is more like a novel, somebody telling you about their experience, versus a very clear structure, like a grid or a table that has everything that you need in it. Depending on what you're wanting to do with that information, that perspective matters. Arguably, what the people did when documenting what that plant was initially, injecting that perspective, that experience into what they were writing is arguably pretty helpful going forward. It's honestly a very human way to want to describe the world. That when we identify something or when we discover something, we just want to make notes about how this thing looks, how this thing makes us feel, or how we can kind of sense this thing. And you'd be surprised how many of these kinds of documentations have like that kind of feeling like part to it. You don't normally think about it when you're reading it initially. You're probably looking for something very specific, where you're just sort of like, okay, but how many petals are on its leaves, or how many leaves are in its leaflet, or in a leaflet, or how many leaflets are on a leaf. What is that leaf structure? But like a lot of these things have, when you crush the leaf, it gives off a particularly bad smell, which is certainly an observation, not really a measurable one by any means, but it could be helpful. At the very least, you know, whoever authored these notes tried to do this interesting thing with this plant that they were trying to identify and found something of particular interest. It probably, as people like found those notes and was like, okay, that's kind of interesting, but I don't know if I'd agree with you. I want to know if I agree with you. They go out there, find these plants, crush the leaf, and smell it. That perspective that injecting that perspective, that human experience into that note-taking has certain rippling effects for the rest of the people for all of the readers of that content later. I guess, like, I don't really have anything that I wanted to necessarily say about any one of these few things that I've talked about here. It's just that I find it kind of interesting how often, when I go looking for meaning in something, I generally, this could just be like a very human thing too, is that when you go to find meaning in something, you'll generally find the meaning you're looking for. Except when I wasn't going in there looking for a meaning, it's just I happened to be thinking about the concept of perspective when writing haiku this month. And like the more I think about it, the more perspective is a very central thing to how we as humans just kind of interface with the world. A lot of why the human experience is very complex is likely just because we have a very high aptitude for perspective and retaining that perspective and being able to communicate that perspective. There's, I guess, a lot of factors that go into that. There are other animals out there that, well, they all have a perspective. It's just whether or not they can retain it and communicate it well. There's probably a few very integral parts of like how the human experience is so different than other things. Not that any other species has really documented their experience to the extent that we have. It's just another thing about what we do. But we just really like our perspective, I guess. We like our perspective on this planet. But yeah, I don't know. That was probably a lot of rambliness, and I don't know how helpful any of that is. There were like several points in there where I was like, I don't really know what I'm going to say next, and maybe I should just cut it off and not do this video. But yeah, I guess I'll just leave you with that. Perspective is kind of interesting. Just how anybody can view something is very dependent on a lot of things. And what we decide to remember or note or document or choose to take away and understand and retain for later, it all changes from person to person. I guess just a lesson in not treating anything like a monolith. That no matter who you're dealing with, what you're dealing with, that perspective is pretty key. That even in something as straightforward as, I shouldn't say straightforward, as accessible as note-taking or taking a picture, that all of that is really just exercises in applying your perspective to communicating with others or potentially yourself in the future. It just seems like a fairly core thing to how we just kind of deal with living on a planet with other people, or just everything else in general, our us being able to exist in a universe. Anyway, getting more and more off track as I go. I had like like 3 to 4 examples of things that I wanted to talk about. And I knew that if I got off of any of those, then it would probably start derailing pretty fast, just because the concept is definitely amorphous. But, I don't know. Fun things to think about, I guess. Little ramblings and musings. Yeah, we'll call it that before I ramble for too long. Hope you're having a wonderful Tuesday, and we'll catch you in the next one. See ya.